She would not lie down. For 15 hours, England's aging queen stood like a corpse that refused to fall, whispering that if she ever touched a bed again, she would never rise. This is the true story of Elizabeth, the first's final days, of a body poisoned by beauty, a mind haunted by ghosts, and a court too terrified to speak the word death. Every moment you're about to hear is taken from real eyewitness accounts and historical records, not legend. If you're ready to walk into that dark, candlelit room with her, stay. And if this chills you, hit subscribe so you don't face the Tudors alone. They said the end began quietly, with a sore throat at Christmas. At Whitehall, in late 1602, Elizabeth's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, her words rasping out as she clutched a cup to soothe the burning in her throat, swallowing more liquid than food. She started turning visitors away in confusion, insisting they had no appointment, even when she herself had summoned them only hours before. The court watched their queen shrink into herself, eating almost nothing, sleeping only in snatches, and complaining of a tiredness that never lifted. By January 1603, she fled the noise of Whitehall for Richmond Palace, the place she said she could best trust her sickly old age, and there the shadows finally closed in. For decades, Elizabeth had survived loss, but now the griefs were piling faster than she could outlive them. Her great favorite Robert Dudley was long dead, her old friend and watcher Blanche Parry gone, her chief minister William Cecil buried. Each loss had taken a piece of her, but she had kept moving. Now the execution of the Earl of Essex lingered in her mind like a wound that would not heal. He had been her dazzling, reckless favorite, and though she had signed his death warrant 2 years before, in her last months she would flinch at his name, fall into sudden tears, or sit in silence when anyone spoke of him. It was as if the ghosts of the men she had loved and condemned had chosen this winter to come back and sit at her side. Then came the final blow. In February 1603, news reached Richmond that Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham Kate, the loyal cousin and lady who had attended Elizabeth for nearly 45 years, was dead. Those who were there said the Queen took this loss harder than Catherine's own husband did. The death was not traumatic, not a murder or a scandal, but for Elizabeth it was the sign she could no longer ignore. Even the oldest, safest faces were vanishing. From that moment, her melancholy deepened into something darker. She stopped changing her clothes. She wandered less in the gardens and more in her own thoughts. "I must die too," she reportedly murmured, again and again, as if the words were not a fear, but a sentence already passed. The change in her habits frightened the people closest to her, because it was so unlike the Elizabeth they knew. This was a queen who had always been fastidious, almost obsessive, about her appearance and her routine, the careful dressing, the layers of silk and jewels, the public walks where she let crowds see her shining and untouchable. Now she sat for hours in dim rooms, refusing bed, refusing food, refusing the medicines her physicians pressed on her. She would rest instead on cushions on the floor, eyes fixed on nothing, one finger pressed absently against her lips, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The woman who had spent a lifetime standing above her court was, for the first time, sinking step by step into a darkness she would not come back from. By the time Elizabeth settled at Richmond, the mask she had worn for decades was starting to slip. For most of her reign, the court had seen only the finished product, the painted white face, the towering wigs, the glittering gowns stitched with pearls that caught the candlelight. Now, in the softer, colder light of early 1603, her ladies saw what the paint and jewels had been hiding. The smallpox that nearly killed her as a young woman had left deep scars. Layer after layer of thick white cosmetic, made from toxic white lead, had been used to blur them out. Over the years, it had done its own damage, burning the skin beneath, thinning her hair, and leaving the flesh around her fingers swollen and tender, where rings she had worn for a lifetime had begun to bite into the skin. One ring mattered more than all the others. Elizabeth's coronation ring, set with a tiny enameled image said to show her joined to her kingdom, had never left her hand in 45 years. It was a symbol and a promise. Removing it would mean admitting that the bond between queen and crown could be broken. But now, in her final months, the finger beneath it had grown so inflamed and enlarged that the metal cut into her like a band of iron. Her attendants, horrified, eventually persuaded her physicians and goldsmiths to act. They had to file the ring away where it met the skin, working carefully so as not to hurt their aging queen more than necessary. When it finally came free, it was more than just a piece of jewelry being removed. It was the quiet, physical proof that the body which had carried the Tudor image for nearly half a century was failing. The rest of the illusion was just as fragile. Under the wigs and fine hoods, much of her once famous red gold hair had thinned or fallen out, a likely result of years of harsh cosmetics and illness. Her natural teeth, ruined by infection and sugar, had either decayed or been pulled, making it painful to eat and hard to speak clearly. To keep her face from collapsing inward, she sometimes packed soft material inside her cheeks before appearing in public, filling out the contours the way she once had with flesh. Her elaborate collars, ruffs, and jewels were not just displays of wealth and power. They were barriers, carefully arranged to draw the eye away from the signs of age and sickness beneath. Yet even as her body weakened, Elizabeth clung fiercely to the rituals that had defined her image. She still insisted on being dressed in rich fabrics, still demanded that her ladies arrange her with care, even if she no longer had the strength to stand for long audiences or revels. This was the paradox of her final days. A queen who knew, perhaps better than anyone, that image was power, trapped in a body that could no longer sustain the image she had built. The court that gathered around her at Richmond saw both realities at once: the magnificent, almost theatrical figure they presented to the world, and the frail woman beneath the paint setting the stage for the moment when she would choose, with terrifying determination, not to lie down at all. While her appearance was being carefully managed, what was happening inside Elizabeth's body was slipping out of everyone's control. The sore throat that had first seemed like a passing infection did not clear. It deepened into a constant rawness that made every swallow an effort. Food, which she had already begun to avoid out of grief and exhaustion, now became almost impossible to take. She sipped small amounts of liquid, more out of duty to those pleading with her than from any real desire. At the same time, another, more ominous change began. Her legs and feet started to swell. The tight shoes and elegant slippers that had once carried her through endless court ceremonies now had to be cut open. The leather split to ease the pressure of fluid building in her limbs. This swelling was not just an uncomfortable symptom of old age. It hinted at something far more serious: her heart and circulation struggling under the weight of years of stress, illness, and the hidden damage from toxic cosmetics and repeated infections. The queen who had once danced late into the night at court masques now found simply standing a strain. Climbing the stairs at Richmond took more out of her than she ever admitted aloud. Breathing grew harder on some days, her chest tight, her voice weaker, so that even when she did speak, those closest to her had to lean in to catch the words. Coughs began to interrupt her attempts at conversation, and there were troubling signs that her lungs were slowly filling with fluid, turning every intake of air into work. Her physicians, trained in the medical thinking of their time, watched all this with increasing alarm. They noted the sleeplessness, the refusal of food, the disturbed breathing, the swelling of her body, and the strange, heavy sadness that never seemed to lift. They bled her when they could persuade her, prescribed tonics and posets, argued quietly among themselves about whether her troubles lay in the lungs, the heart, or the humors of the mind. But medicine at the dawn of the 17th century could not properly diagnose what modern eyes might call heart failure, pneumonia, or the cumulative toll of years of strain and poisoning. To them, their queen was suffering from a mixture of deep melancholy and a wasting sickness that they could describe but not reverse. Elizabeth, however, understood one thing with frightening clarity. Once she gave in fully to being a patient, she would no longer be a ruler. The more her body betrayed her, the more stubborn she became in small, symbolic acts of control. She chose when to sit and when to rise. She chose when to speak and when to answer with only a look. And as standing and walking became harder, a new, more disturbing pattern appeared. Rather than go to bed and admit defeat, she began to spend longer and longer hours settled on cushions and carpets on the floor, as though if she could just stay somewhere between full command and complete collapse, she might hold off the end. That fragile balance between a failing body and an iron will would soon push her into the most haunting episode of her final days. The closer Elizabeth moved toward that haunting episode, the more it seemed as if her mind and body were fighting each other. On the surface, those around her could describe clear physical signs: the swollen legs, the labored breath, the dry mouth from days of barely eating or drinking. But beneath those symptoms was something far less visible and far more frightening, a mind that had carried the weight of a kingdom for nearly half a century, beginning to fracture under guilt, fear, and exhaustion. The queen who had outplayed assassins, rebellions, and foreign powers now found herself wrestling with an enemy she could not outthink. The knowledge that her strength was finally running out, and that the moment she surrendered to it, everything she had built would pass into other hands. Contemporaries noticed the change in her temperament as clearly as they observed the failure of her health. Her melancholy, once an occasional shadow, deepened into long silences. She would sit for hours, eyes fixed on a single point, as if replaying scenes from her own reign. The signatures on death warrants, the victories, the betrayals, the faces of those who were gone. People close to her spoke later of how the memory of the Earl of Essex seemed to trouble her, especially in those last weeks, along with the fresh loss of Catherine Howard, the loyal attendant who had been a constant presence for decades. These were not abstract regrets. They were personal ghosts, tightening their circle around a woman who had always used performance and ritual to keep such thoughts at bay. At the same time, her reactions to the living grew sharper and more unpredictable. Courtiers who once knew exactly how to please her now found themselves wrong-footed. She might wave one away with an abrupt gesture, or refuse to speak to another who had done nothing obvious to offend. The council, already anxious about the unresolved question of the succession, watched this behavior with rising dread. They needed the queen clear-headed enough to give any sign about who should follow her, especially regarding James VI of Scotland. Instead, they were faced with a monarch slipping in and out of engagement with the world, sometimes attentive, sometimes as unreachable as if she were already half on the other side. From a modern perspective, what Elizabeth endured in these last weeks looks like a brutal convergence of physical illness and psychological collapse. Long-term exposure to toxic cosmetics, old infections, possible heart and lung disease, and years of sleeplessness and stress would have been enough to unsteady anyone. Layered on top of that was grief, unresolved guilt, and the terror of losing control after a lifetime spent carefully managing every gesture and word. It is in this context that her later refusal to lie down makes a terrible kind of sense. Before she ever stood for those 15 hours, she had already begun to live in a state of refusing food, refusing rest, refusing to let others decide what her decline would look like. Section by section, symptom by symptom, her world was narrowing to a single question. If she could no longer rule her court, could she at least command the way she met her own end? There is a moment, late in March 1603, when all of those refusals harden into one terrifying decision. The queen who has been drifting between cushions on the floor, half patient and half ruler, suddenly chooses a position and will not move from it. According to those who were there, Elizabeth rises and stands in her chamber, fully dressed, and simply stays there. No throne, no canopy, no public ceremony. just an old woman in her late 60s, robe hanging from her thinning frame, rooted to one spot on the floor of Richmond Palace, while her ladies look on in growing panic. Hours pass. She leans on cushions piled behind her, sometimes resting against them, but she does not lie down. When they beg her to take to her bed, she answers with a single chilling belief. If she lies down, she will never get up again. For a younger woman, that might have sounded like superstition. For Elizabeth, it was a political and personal truth. Bed meant surrender. Bed meant admitting that the queen who had outlived plots, invasions, and rivals had finally met something she could not defeat. So she stands. Afternoon slides into evening, then into night. Candles are brought and replaced. The room grows stuffy with wax and breath and fear. Servants slip in and out, whispering about her condition. Members of the household drift to the doorway and back again, not wanting to stare and yet unable to look away. Each time someone suggests she rest properly, she refuses, sometimes with words, sometimes with a look sharp enough to end the conversation. The strain on her failing body is immense. Her legs, already swollen and painful, tremble under the weight of hours. Her breathing, made heavy by the fluid in her chest, becomes more labored the longer she forces herself upright. But this is where decades of habit and willpower show their darkest edge. Elizabeth has spent nearly half a century performing strength standing firm before ambassadors, riding out before her troops, walking slowly and majestically through packed halls, so her subjects could see their queen with their own eyes. Now, all of that training turns inward. There is no crowd to impress, no foreign enemy to intimidate. The only thing she is defying is the weakening of her own flesh. By the time those around her realize just how long she has been in that position, it is already too late to undo the damage. Accounts speak of her standing for something like 15 hours, supported at times by cushions or attendants, but refusing the one simple act that might have brought some relief, lying down. The room around her becomes a kind of private stage for a final, desperate performance of control. Her ladies hover nearby, ready to catch her if she falls. Physicians wait helplessly, knowing that every minute she remains upright is worsening the very symptoms they are trying to treat. And yet, no one can truly force a woman who has ruled them all their lives to do what she has decided not to do. That long, terrible vigil on her feet is where the legend of the queen who would not lie down is born, and it is the point from which the rest of her final collapse will unfold. By the time that long, terrible stand finally ended, the room around Elizabeth looked less like a royal chamber and more like a sick room that no one dared to name. Her ladies, who had watched her legs shake and her face grow paler with each passing hour, had already begun to arrange cushions and carpets on the floor behind her, silently preparing for the moment they all knew was coming. When it happened, it was not a dramatic collapse with shouted orders and rushing footsteps. Her strength simply ebbed away. The queen who had refused a bed could no longer command her own limbs. Her knees buckled, and instead of being carried to the great canopied bed that waited only a few steps away, she eased down onto the spread of cushions her attendants had laid at her feet, sinking into them like a ship settling into deep water. What followed was, in some ways, more disturbing than the stand itself. Elizabeth did not treat the cushions as a pause or a brief rest before doing what everyone expected. She accepted this low, makeshift nest as the place she would stay. Day and night blurred together as she remained there, propped up but never fully reclined, her back against bolsters, her skirts spread around her on the floor. For roughly 4 days, according to later accounts, she spoke little or not at all. The woman whose words had once commanded armies and reshaped Europe allowed only fragments to escape. A murmur, a brief reply, a gesture. Her ladies tried to tempt her with broths, wine, and soft foods. She turned her head away or let the cup pass her lips without swallowing much. It was not just that eating and drinking were difficult. It was as if she had decided that nothing offered by this world could help her now. The atmosphere in the chamber thickened with a kind of helpless fear. Courtiers and council members came and went, treading softly over the rushes, peering at their queen from a respectful distance. Some knelt at the edge of the cushions, speaking her name, trying to draw her back into conversation. Others watched how little she reacted and left with dread written plainly on their faces. Outside the room, discussions about the succession grew more urgent, but inside, everything narrowed to the slow rhythm of her breathing and the occasional rustle as a lady adjusted a pillow or smoothed a fold of cloth. The great bed nearby, symbol of royal rest, of ceremony, of deathbeds where witnesses could stand in ordered rows, remained untouched. Elizabeth had chosen the floor instead, as if refusing even in this to give the moment the dignity of ritual. Yet even in her silence, she retained a strange kind of authority. No one dared simply lift her and carry her to bed. No counselor strode in to override her will. The same deference that had shaped her life now trapped those around her. They were bound by respect and habit to obey a woman who could barely speak. So the court waited, watching a queen who was already half withdrawn from them, unable to act without her consent, and unable to bear what her consent might mean. That long, low vigil on the cushions became the hinge of her final days. She was no longer the ruling, speaking Elizabeth, not yet the dying figure laid out formally on her bed. She hovered between those states, eyes open, lips mostly closed, holding everyone else in suspension until the pressure of events and the needs of the kingdom forced the council to confront the question she had refused to settle outright. What would happen after her gaze finally left the world? While Elizabeth hovered on those cushions, refusing bed and drifting in and out of silence, the people beyond her chamber were running out of time. The question of her body, would she eat? Would she drink? Would she lie down? Had fused with a far more dangerous question. What would happen to England the moment she stopped breathing? No husband, no child, no officially named heir. For a generation, she had kept the crown balanced on her own head, promising nothing about what came next. Now, as she stared past the faces around her, the council could feel the old nightmare closing in. If she died without even a hint of her wishes, the kingdom might be dragged into the chaos she herself had once survived. So the men who had served her for years came creeping closer to that circle of cushions, not just out of devotion, but out of urgent political need. Cecil, Howard, the counselors who had managed wars and treaties under her, now had to manage the silence of a single dying woman. They sent trusted figures into the room, people she might respond to, a favorite lady, a long-familiar courtier, a churchman whose voice she had heard countless times in chapel. One by one, they tried to coax a sign from her, a word, a nod, anything. Some asked after her health. Others circled the subject more carefully, hinting at the future of the realm, at the security of your people. Each time, the same strange stillness met them. Elizabeth might glance at them, might shift slightly among the cushions, but then her gaze would wander away again, back to that fixed, unknowable point in the middle distance. Outside the chamber, news of her condition seeped through the palace like damp. Servants whispered in corridors, repeating scraps they'd overheard, that she hadn't slept, that she hadn't taken more than a few sips, that she hadn't spoken clearly in hours. Messengers rode between Richmond and London, carrying guarded reports, because any hint that the Queen was near death could unsettle the city and invite dangerous speculation. For the ordinary people who heard only rumors, it must have felt like waiting for a storm they could not see. Everyone knew it was coming. No one knew how violent it would be. The image of their queen, once so visible at progresses and on feast days, had retreated behind closed doors and tight-lipped officials. Inside, the pressure built. The counselors could not openly argue in front of their sovereign, but their anxiety sharpened every glance and whispered conference. They knew who the leading candidate was, James VI of Scotland, the Protestant king who, by blood, had the strongest claim through Henry VII's line. Many of them had already been in secret contact with him, carefully laying the groundwork for a smooth transition. But a smooth transition required something they did not yet have, at least the appearance of Elizabeth's approval. Without it, any proclamation might be seen as a coup, and rivals could rise up with their own candidates. That is why the Queen's refusal to speak, to lie down, to perform even the traditional gestures of a deathbed, felt so unbearable. Her silence was not empty. It was the one thing that could still throw the kingdom into uncertainty. As the hours on the cushions stretched into days, the shape of the crisis became clear. Elizabeth was no longer actively ruling, but she was not yet gone. The council could not replace her, but they could also no longer rely on her to settle what came after. They were trapped in her twilight, waiting for one of two things: either a moment of clarity in which she would finally give a sign, or the instant when her chest would rise no more, and they would have to act without her blessing. That tension between duty to their living queen and responsibility to the country she would soon leave is what drove them at last to ask her the most dangerous question of all while she still sat on those cushions. Who, if anyone, did she want to wear the crown after her? On one of those last strained days on the cushions, duty finally forced the council to cut through the silence. They could no longer simply watch their queen fade and hope the future arranged itself. Someone had to ask her directly what no one had dared to press her on for years. So they sent in a small group of trusted men senior counselors who had served her longest, and a few familiar faces she might still recognize through the fog of pain and exhaustion. They did not begin with blunt questions. First came prayers, soft words about her health, about God's mercy, about her long, victorious reign. Only when those landed without anger did they edge toward the heart of it. For the peace of England, they said gently, it would be a comfort if she indicated whom she wished to follow her. Different witnesses later gave different versions of what happened next, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this moment so haunting. One account, repeated for generations, claims that when they spoke the name of James of Scotland, Elizabeth stirred. Too weak to speak, she is said to have lifted her hand slowly to her head, touching it in a way that suggested a crown. Those watching took it as a sign, a silent, regal assent to James as her heir. In that reading, the Virgin Queen, who had avoided naming a successor, all her life finally yielded, at the very end placing the future of her kingdom in the hands of a man she had never met, but whose claim she quietly acknowledged. But other reports hint at a different scene. Some suggest that by the time these questions were put plainly, Elizabeth was already slipping beyond clear understanding, her responses more instinct than decision. A gesture could be interpreted in multiple ways: a hand moving toward the head to ease discomfort, an arm lifting simply because someone called her name. Later writers and politicians had strong reasons to frame the story neatly: a dying queen, a clear choice, a smooth handover. A small, ambiguous movement could be polished into a deliberate sign. After all, a narrative in which James was chosen by Elizabeth herself strengthened his legitimacy and calmed fears of a disputed succession. Standing behind that neat story is a harsher possibility: that the real decision had already been made without her. Long before these final days, key counselors had been corresponding with James, quietly preparing for the moment the throne would fall vacant. They knew his Protestant faith, his royal blood, and his existing rule in Scotland made him the safest option to avoid civil war. By the time they leaned over their queen on those cushions, they were not asking an open question so much as seeking a blessing on a path they had already chosen. Whether Elizabeth truly understood or not, whether her hand really meant yes, or was simply seized upon as such, her legend was bound to the version of events that England most needed to believe. For your video, this is the perfect place to lean into that ambiguity without repeating earlier points. You have a queen who can no longer stand, a council that can no longer wait, and a single, disputed gesture that decides the future, at least on paper. From here, you can flow directly into the next segment, the moment they finally lift her from the cushions at Richmond. carry her to the bed she has feared for days, and the quiet, watching world beyond those walls that is about to learn its longest-serving monarch has only one night left to live. They had their answer, or at least the gesture they needed to tell themselves they did. And once that fragile business of succession was settled, there was only one thing left they dared to insist on, that Elizabeth leave the floor. By now she had been on those cushions for days, her body sinking deeper into exhaustion, her mind drifting further away. The ladies who had watched her every twitch and breath knew she could not stay like that much longer. So, gently but firmly, they closed in. No grand commands, no sharp orders, just urgent kindness. They told her she would rest better higher up. They promised she would be easier to tend. They reminded her that the bed waiting only a few steps away was not just a place of weakness, but the rightful place for a queen at the end. For a long time, she resisted even this. Bed still meant finality. On the cushions, she could pretend she was merely choosing an awkward, uncomfortable vigil. In the bed, she would be unmistakably dying. But the body that had carried her through half a century of rule could no longer obey the iron rules of her will. Each hour on the floor left her weaker, her breathing rougher, her voice almost entirely gone. The people closest to her began to speak of her with a different tone, not as a sovereign who might rally, but as a soul who needed peace. At some point, perhaps worn down by their pleading, or simply unable to hold her own line any longer, Elizabeth allowed herself to be moved. It was not a grand procession. A small group of attendants and ladies gathered around her, lifting carefully, mindful of the swelling in her limbs and the fragility of her frame. They carried her those few steps that had seemed more terrifying than any battlefield, from the low nest of cushions to the tall, canopied bed that dominated the chamber. The great hangings, embroidered and heavy, had witnessed years of royal rest and recovery. Now they would watch something else. As they settled her onto the mattress, propping her with pillows so she could lie slightly raised, the symbolism was brutal and clear. The queen who had once stood in armor before her troops at Tilbury was now laid out like any other mortal woman preparing for her last night. The room itself seemed to change when she finally lay down. On the floor, everything had felt temporary, unresolved, a strange liminal state where no one dared call what they were seeing a deathbed. On the bed, the old rituals of a monarch's final hours began to reassemble themselves almost automatically. Candles were arranged more carefully. Access to the chamber tightened. Names were noted. Who was present would matter later. Somewhere beyond the walls, messengers and counselors prepared for the next morning, for proclamations and rides to London. But around the bed, the focus narrowed to Elizabeth's face, to the slow movement of her chest, to the occasional flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had finally crossed the line she had feared for days. She had laid down, and she would not rise again. The next voices to fill that room would not be counselors pressing her for decisions, but churchmen praying her into whatever came after the crown. Once Elizabeth was finally on the bed, the tone of the room shifted from argument and persuasion to something closer to a vigil. The struggle over whether she would lie down was over. Now the contest was between time and the people trying to ease her way out of the world. Her breathing had become heavier and more uneven, her voice almost completely lost. Those closest to her could no longer pretend she might recover. They sent word for the one figure whose presence at a royal deathbed was both spiritual comfort and official confirmation that the end was near, the Archbishop of Canterbury. John Whitgift was an old man himself by this point, a stern churchman who had served through the tensions and clashes of Elizabeth's later reign. Now, instead of preaching before a court or arguing over policy, he came into a dim, crowded bedchamber at Richmond to kneel beside a queen who could barely respond. He was not alone. A group of chaplains accompanied him, along with trusted courtiers like Robert Carey, and members of the household who had watched the Queen's decline day by day. What followed is one of the clearest scenes recorded from her final hours. Whitgift knelt and began to pray aloud, asking for mercy, for peace, for a gentle end to a life spent in the service of the realm. His voice, worn but steady, filled the space that had for days been dominated by whispers and half-ended sentences. At first, there was no obvious reaction from the bed. Elizabeth lay propped against her pillows, eyes partly closed, body still. The Archbishop's words went on, weaving their way through the psalms and supplications that had comforted countless dying believers. Time stretched. Witnesses later said he prayed for so long that his own strength began to fail, his knees aching on the hard floor, his voice growing hoarse. At one point he tried to stop, perhaps thinking the Queen could no longer hear him, or that he had said all there was to say. But then came a small movement. Elizabeth's hand, which had lain limp on the coverlet, stirred. She lifted her fingers just enough to signal that he should continue. That tiny gesture, caught and interpreted by the women near her one account, names a Lady Scrope as the one who understood. It meant everything to those watching. It was proof that, somewhere inside the failing body and fading mind, the Queen was still present enough to choose. She could not speak a confession or deliver a speech. She could not issue new orders or change the course that had been set for the succession. But she could ask silently for the prayers to go on. So Whitgift gathered his strength and did exactly that, pushing himself past his own fatigue to keep praying beside her bed for another long stretch of time. The chaplains around him joined in, their voices rising and falling in the half-dark, while servants and courtiers stood or knelt in tense silence. In that moment, Richmond Palace held two different kinds of waiting. Outside the chamber, messengers and counselors were preparing for the political dawn, the proclamations, the rides to London, the delicate task of announcing a new monarch without seeming to rejoice in the old one's passing. Inside the chamber, around the bed, the waiting was much simpler and far more intimate. They were watching a woman who had once embodied an entire era take the last steps that no crown could postpone. The long prayers, the single raised hand, the weary Archbishop refusing to leave his knees. These details turned her death from a vague rumor into a lived, witnessed event. And they set up the quiet transition that would follow. Not another dramatic act of will from Elizabeth, but a slipping away so gentle that those at her side would later say she left the world almost like someone finally closing her eyes after a very long day. After the Archbishop finally finished his prayers, and the chapel voices faded to silence, something shifted in the chamber. The urgency that had driven those last days, the questions about succession, the attempts to coax her from the floor, the desperate need for answers, all of that drained away. What remained was simply a group of exhausted people watching a dying woman, and the quiet understanding that there was nothing left to do but let her go. Robert Carey, who had knelt weeping beside the Archbishop, withdrew with the others, leaving Elizabeth to her most trusted ladies and physicians. The night settled deeper around Richmond, the candles burning low, the palace beyond the door beginning to hold its breath. Somewhere in those final hours, Elizabeth slipped from wakefulness into something that looked like true rest. For days she had fought sleep as she had fought the bed itself, as if closing her eyes might mean losing her grip on the world entirely. But now, with the prayers said and the weight of expectation lifted, her body finally allowed itself what it had been denied. Her breathing, which had been labored and uneven, smoothed into a slower, steadier rhythm. The tension that had kept her upright on the floor, that had held her hand raised to signal the Archbishop, gradually loosened. She was no longer struggling. She was simply drifting, somewhere between the room and whatever lay beyond it. The women who sat with her through that last night later described an end so gentle, it barely seemed like an end at all. There was no sudden crisis, no choking or convulsions, no dramatic final words. Instead, in the early hours of March 24th, 1603 accounts suggest around 3 a.m, when the world is at its darkest and quietest, Elizabeth's breathing grew softer and softer until it simply stopped. One witness would later write that she passed mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from the tree, an image meant to convey peace, naturalness, a life that had reached its full span and let go without force. Another said she seemed to fall asleep and never wake, as if death were nothing more than a deeper kind of rest. Dr. Perry, one of her physicians, was present at the moment she ceased breathing. He is said to have murmured a prayer over her, sending her soul forward with the same formal care that had attended every stage of her reign. The attendants stood or knelt in silence, some weeping quietly, others too numb with exhaustion to react. Outside, the palace still slept, unaware that the woman who had ruled them for 45 years longer than many of them had been alive was now gone. The great bed which she had feared and resisted had become the place where the longest reign in living memory ended, not with thunder or spectacle, but with the kind of stillness that comes when a flame finally burns down to nothing and goes out. When the last breath left her body, something larger than a single life ended with it. The women in the room understood this immediately, even through their grief. Elizabeth had been more than their queen. She had been the thread connecting them to a world that was now, in an instant, becoming the past. For 45 years, longer than most memories could stretch, she had been the constant surviving plots, wars, religious upheavals, and the deaths of everyone who had stood beside her at her coronation. Her father Henry had torn England apart to secure a male heir and build a dynasty. Her sister Mary had tried to drag the country back to Rome, and Elizabeth had spent nearly half a century holding the whole fragile structure, together refusing to marry, refusing to name a successor, ruling alone until the very last moment. Now, in a quiet room at Richmond, with no fanfare and no witnesses beyond a handful of exhausted attendants, the Tudor line died with her. The news could not be kept in that chamber for long. Within the hour, word rippled through the palace. The Queen is gone. Servants woke, courtiers gathered in hushed clusters, and those who had been waiting in outer rooms for days finally understood why the tension had suddenly broken. But the machinery of power does not pause for mourning. Even as Elizabeth's body was being tended by her ladies, even as prayers were whispered and candles were lit around her bed, Robert Cecil, her chief minister, the man who had quietly steered the kingdom through its final uncertain years, was already moving. He knew that the longer England went without a declared monarch, the greater the risk of rivals, panic, or rebellion. So he did what Elizabeth herself had spent a lifetime avoiding. He made the succession certain, loudly and immediately. Cecil left Richmond before dawn, riding hard for London with a small group of trusted men. By the time the city woke, he was ready to proclaim James VI of Scotland as James I of England, presenting the transition not as a rupture, but as the natural, rightful continuation of royal authority. It was a masterpiece of political timing. No pause for doubt, no space for competing claims, just a smooth, confident announcement that the throne had passed and the realm was secure. For the people hearing church bells ring out the news, the message was clear. Their old queen was dead, but England itself would go on, unbroken. Yet beneath the efficiency and the careful management, there was a genuine sense of an ending that could not be managed away. The Tudors had been England's identity for over a century. Henry VII's rise, Henry VIII's break with Rome, the turmoil of Edward and Mary, and then Elizabeth's long, glittering, exhausting performance of majesty. All of that was over. The new king was a foreigner, a Scot, from a different dynasty and a different world. He would bring his own court, his own habits, his own vision. For those who had known only Elizabeth, the future was both a relief and a mystery. The woman who had refused to lie down until her body gave out had also refused to let go of power until her very last breath. And now, finally, history could move forward without her hand on the wheel. What remained was her body, and the question of what would be done with it, a question that would lead to decisions she had explicitly forbidden, and a final indignity she could no longer prevent. Elizabeth had made her wishes about her body, clear long before that March morning. She did not want the procedure that royal custom almost always demanded: the opening of the corpse, the removal of the internal organs, the embalming from the inside out that was meant to preserve the flesh for weeks of lying in state and ceremonial display. The thought of it horrified her, and she had said so plainly, when she died, her body was to be left intact. It was one of the few instructions she had managed to communicate in those final, fading months, and it mattered to her in a way that went beyond simple squeamishness. Perhaps it was a last assertion of control over the body that had been painted, corseted, and displayed for half a century. Perhaps it was a deeply personal revulsion at the idea of being cut open, exposed, handled by strangers after death in ways she would never have allowed in life. Whatever the reason, the command was explicit, and those who heard it knew it was not a suggestion. But Elizabeth was barely cold in her bed before that wish was quietly set aside. Robert Cecil, the man who had served her so loyally and managed her final transition so smoothly, made a choice that put political necessity ahead of her explicit orders. A royal funeral required time to arrange processions, gather mourners, prepare Westminster Abbey, and allow the realm to witness the passage of power in solemn, visible ritual. That meant the body had to last, preserved well enough to lie in state without decay, becoming visible, or, worse, offensive. In Cecil's mind, and in the minds of the officials who made these decisions, there was no real alternative. Custom, practicality, and the dignity of the occasion all pointed in one direction, and the dead queen's personal horror of the procedure simply could not be allowed to interfere. So while Cecil rode to London to proclaim James, while the court adjusted to the new reign, and the palace began its transformation from deathbed, vigil to state funeral, the surgeons and embalmers went to work behind closed doors at Richmond. They did what had been done to kings and queens before her: opened the body, removed what would spoil fastest, treated the interior with preservatives, and stitched it all back together with the efficiency of men who had performed this task many times. It was methodical, professional, and completely against her stated will. No one consulted her ladies about whether this was truly necessary. No one paused to reconsider whether a queen who had defied so many conventions in life deserved to have this one final boundary respected. The decision had been made, and by the time anyone might have questioned it, the work was already done. When they finished, Elizabeth's body was wrapped, sealed, and placed inside a lead-lined wooden coffin designed to contain any further changes that might occur before burial. The woman who had spent her last days refusing to lie down, who had stood for 15 hours rather than admit defeat, was now locked inside a box she could not protest, prepared for a funeral she would never see, her last clear instruction ignored by the very people who claimed to honor her memory. It was the first betrayal after death, but it would not be the last indignity her body would suffer before it finally reached its tomb. What the embalmers encountered when they began their work was a body that told a very different story from the one the world had been allowed to see. For nearly half a century, Elizabeth had appeared before her court in full regalia. The white face, the elaborate ruffs, the jeweled gowns, the towering wigs that added height and presence. Every public appearance had been a carefully staged performance, and the performance had required a foundation that by the end was doing more harm than the worst enemy ever could. Now, with no audience left to deceive and no will left to resist, the truth of what those decades of image-making had cost her became impossible to hide. The face they worked on was not the pale, smooth visage from portraits and public memory. It was caked in layers of old cosmetic that had built up over years. A thick white mask made from Venetian ceruse, a fashionable poison of the age. White lead mixed with vinegar had given her that ghostly, ageless appearance that hid the smallpox scars from her near death in 1562, but it had also been slowly destroying the skin beneath. By the time of her death, that makeup had become almost part of her, and reports suggested it cracked and hardened, in places making her face look less like living flesh and more like a painted statue that had begun to crumble. Underneath, where the embalmers could finally see, the damage was extensive. Skin thinned and discolored, scarring that no amount of lead could truly erase. The physical record of a woman who had sacrificed her body to maintain an image of untouchable majesty. Her hair, once the famous red gold that poets had celebrated, was mostly gone. Decades of harsh treatments, wigs, and the toxic effects of lead and mercury-based cosmetics had thinned it to near nothing. What remained was brittle and sparse, the hair of someone much older and more worn than even her 69 years would suggest. The elaborate curls and styles that had framed her public face had all been artificial, built on frames and padding, another layer of the illusion. Beneath the wigs and veils, Elizabeth had been going bald for years, a secret kept by her most trusted ladies and now laid bare in death. Her mouth told its own grim story. The teeth that remained were blackened stunts, rotted by years of sugar consumption and untreated infections. Dental abscesses had likely been part of the throat pain that plagued her final weeks, contributing to her refusal of food and her hoarse, failing voice. Some accounts even suggest that glands in her neck had swollen and possibly burst in the days before death, adding to the damage that decades of poor health and toxic cosmetics had already done. This was the reality the embalmers faced, not the Gloriana of legend, not the Virgin Queen of pageants and processions, but an old woman whose body bore the brutal marks of a lifetime spent performing power at any cost. And once they finished their work and sealed her inside that lead coffin, they ensured that this version of Elizabeth, broken, poisoned, and painfully human, would never be what the public saw. Instead, a lifelike effigy would be crafted for the funeral, beautiful and serene, one last performance of the image she had died trying to maintain. The funeral that followed was designed to be a grand spectacle, the kind of carefully orchestrated farewell that Elizabeth herself had understood better than anyone. Her coffin, heavy with lead lining meant to contain and preserve, was placed on a ceremonial carriage draped in purple velvet. Above it, where the sealed wood hid what lay beneath, rested a life-sized effigy of the Queen, painted and dressed to perfection. This painted figure wore the robes and crown Elizabeth could no longer carry, its face smooth and serene, its hair full and richly colored, everything the woman inside the coffin was not. It was a final, masterful piece of theater, allowing mourners to grieve the image they remembered, rather than confront the reality of what time and vanity had done. The procession moved slowly from Richmond toward Westminster, winding through streets lined with thousands who had come to witness the passage of their longest reigning monarch. Bells tolled across London, their deep, steady rhythm marking each slow turn of the carriage wheels. Nobles walked behind in strict order of rank, their black mourning clothes stark against the pale spring sky. Common people pressed close to the barriers, some weeping openly, others standing in stunned silence, as the woman who had been queen, their entire lives, rolled past them for the last time. It should have been a solemn, dignified journey, a nation saying farewell to an era. But the body inside that sealed coffin had other plans. Decomposition does not wait for ceremony. Despite the embalming, despite the lead lining, despite every precaution the embalmers had taken, the natural process of decay continued in the darkness of that sealed space. Gases built up inside the coffin as the body broke down, pressure mounting steadily as the procession moved through the city. No one watching from the street could have known what was happening. They saw only the slow, stately carriage, the effigy crowned and peaceful, the ranks of mourners following in perfect order. But inside the lead and wood, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. Then, somewhere along that long route through London, it happened. Accounts describe a sound like a gunshot, sharp and sudden enough to startle the mourners walking closest to the carriage. The coffin had cracked open. The buildup of gases from decomposition had split the wood, breaking the seal that was supposed to hold until burial. Some witnesses later claimed the sound was so loud it echoed off the buildings lining the street, momentarily drowning out even the tolling bells. What came after was worse. the unmistakable evidence that the body inside was not the eternal, untouchable figure the effigy represented, but mortal flesh obeying the same laws of decay as any corpse left too long unburied. The procession did not stop. Attendants quickly moved to cover the damage, adjusting the drapes and keeping the crowd back, ensuring that the spectacle continued as planned. But for those close enough to hear that crack and understand what it meant, the illusion had shattered as surely as the coffin itself. Elizabeth, who had controlled her image so fiercely in life, who had refused to lie down until her body gave out, had been betrayed one final time, not by enemies or conspirators, but by the simple, brutal fact of mortality that no amount of lead or ceremony could contain. The cracked coffin and the effigy resting above it captured, in one brutal image, the contradiction that had defined Elizabeth's entire reign. She had built an empire on appearance, on the careful construction of an untouchable, ageless queen who belonged more to myth than to flesh. But the foundation of that myth had been poison, applied daily for more than 40 years, and by the time her body reached Westminster Abbey, the cost of that choice was impossible to ignore. Venetian ceruse, the white lead paste that gave her that ghostly porcelain complexion, was not a secret. Everyone at court knew what it was made from. White lead ground into powder, mixed with vinegar and water, then spread thick across the face and neck to create a flawless mask. It covered the pockmarks left by smallpox. It erased the signs of age and sleepless nights, and it became as much a part of her royal identity as the crown itself. But lead does not stay on the surface. It seeps into the skin, enters the bloodstream, and accumulates in the bones and brain. Over decades, it destroys from the inside. Hair falls out. Memory falters, tremors begin. The body swells in strange places, and the mind grows clouded and unstable. Elizabeth's final months showed almost every classic symptom of chronic lead poisoning. The hair loss that forced her to rely on wigs, the swelling in her hands and legs, the confusion and mood changes that her attendants tried to explain as grief or old age, the seizures some accounts mention in her last days. Even her refusal to eat might have been worsened by lead's effects on the digestive system, adding nausea and loss of appetite to the melancholy that already gripped her. Modern toxicologists, looking back at the evidence, see a textbook case of slow, cumulative poisoning, not traumatic or sudden, but grinding and relentless, each year adding another layer of damage that could never be undone. And it was not just the lead. The other cosmetics of the era layered on additional toxins, mercury in rouge and treatments for skin conditions, arsenic in some powders meant to enhance the whiteness even further. Taken together, these substances turned the daily ritual of being Elizabeth, of constructing the Virgin Queen for public view, into a kind of slow self-destruction. She knew the risks. Everyone did. Warnings about the dangers of white lead cosmetics were circulating even in her lifetime. But the alternative was to appear before her court and her people as a scarred, aging woman, vulnerable and ordinary, and that was a price she would never pay. So she chose the poison over the truth, every single day, for 4 decades. She stood before armies, ambassadors, and crowds, with that white mask firmly in place, projecting power and control, even as her body weakened beneath the weight of it. And when she finally fell, when she could no longer stand, or speak, or hold the performance together, the evidence of what that choice had cost her was written into every part of her. In the hair that was gone, the skin that had cracked, the mind that had clouded, and the body that had quite literally fallen apart. The woman who refused to lie down had been dying on her feet for years, one layer of white lead at a time.